Good evening, Berwick-on-Tweed. Welcome back to the 314th Annual Midnight Revenant 5K, proudly sponsored by Sorrowfield Mortuary and Which Way Bread Company, the only loaf worth stealing. We're just moments away from the starting bell as our beloved local revenant, Lord Vellum of the Filthy Ledgers, once again claws his way out of Plot 6 to begin his nightly tour of shame and torment. Let's check in with our trackside correspondent, Bud Dupree, down at Corpse Corner. Bud?
Thanks, Todd. I'm standing about 5 feet from where Lord Vellum's decomposing claw will erupt through the dirt at any second now. The crowd is electric, and I gotta say, the smell is sickening. Things are shaping up to be the most exciting Revenant 5K yet.
And there he is, folks, right on schedule. Eyeless, barefoot, and already foaming at the mouth with a mix of guilt and ectoplasm. What a treat.
He's up, he's running, and here come the hounds, Todd. 5 of them tonight, with that big one, Chopper, leading the pack. Just look at that dead man sprint.
Amazing form. Say what you will about eternal punishment, but it does wonders for one's cardio. Oh, he's clearing the old gallows arch. That's a 6-foot vertical, no muscles, all sin.
Hot bone bras, Kurt Cider, get your Revenant raffle tickets. Winner gets to throw the first clove of garlic.
He's lost his left arm again, Todd. Just came clean off at the elbow. That's gonna cost him in the 3rd leg of the race.
Classic Vellum, always falling apart but never backing down. And remember, folks, proceeds from tonight's event go to rebuild the chapel that caught fire mysteriously twice fund. Stick around for post-race interviews, assuming Lord Vellum lives to tell the tale, which he won't, because he's already dead. If you're just tuning in, folks, you missed a real thriller of a halfway mark. Lord Vellum attempted a shortcut through Widow's Alley, but slipped on a centuries-old puddle of remorse and took out a memorial bench on his way down.
That bench was donated by the Ghost Rotary Club in 1873, Todd. We're told its splinters have already been gathered and repurposed into next year's participation medals.
Let's check the leaderboard. First place, still the Hellhounds. Second place, also the Hellhounds. Vellum, technically not on the board yet, due to being momentarily disassembled after his brush with the baptistry stairs.
But look at that recovery! He's duct taping his thighs back on with what appears to be an old excommunication notice. That's the grit you love to see from a disgraced noble revenant, Todd.
Incredible! He just leapt clean over 2 headstones and an open grave filled with regret. And, yes, he's flipped off the vicar's statue on the way down. Classic Berwick spirit.
Meanwhile, the lead hellhound, Chopper, has caught a scent and is gaining fast. If Vellum doesn't increase his velocity, he's looking at another mauling before the next checkpoint at Plague Gate.
We should note that this year's course has an added challenge, the Haunted Scarecrow Maze. Vellum's entering it now, and yep, there he goes, immediately punched in the face by a ghost farmer. That's a 5-second penalty.
Oh my God! He just vaulted the haunted wishing well, using only his remaining femur as a pole. I haven't seen that move since the 91 Undead Olympics.
And here he is. He's rounding the old gallows post in the final stretch. The dogs are nipping at his heels. Literally, his heels are now off. He's sprinting, dragging 1 foot, and screaming something unintelligible about unpaid debts and eternal fire.
And he makes it! He's in the ground! Hounds vanish in a puff of sulfur and unresolved trauma. Folks, we have ourselves another Berwick miracle!
And that is your 314th Annual Revenant 5K. What a night, what a court. Join us next year for the inaugural Melrose Midnight Marathon featuring a disgraced priest and a haunted scythe and 3 friars being a real bitch about the cold.
Till next time, stay safe out there, keep your sins confessed, and remember, if you hear hounds howling, run!
Citizens of the milkiest of ways, you have arrived. We're the milk curdles, the milk of the Milky Way curdles, and that is the Creep Street Podcast. Oh, yes, yes, yes. Folks, you can already feel, at least here, you can already feel the brisk chill of fall in the air. We had a hot summer, and then suddenly it just took a nosedive right into fall.
It really did, at least here in Michigan.
Yeah, And what I want you to do at home right now is close your eyes, and I want you to imagine the entire fall season. The spooky season is like a hot bath, and you gotta dip your toe in a little bit. A little hot. Okay, you're gonna put the foot down in. Okay, now you're gonna ease down in there. That's right. We have a wonderful fall. It just makes me think of fall. My source for today, none other than a book, The Best of British Ghost Stories, Volume 3 by Sophie Jackson. Now, folks, these days when we think about a vampire, we typically don't see a shambling corpse or a bloated, purple-faced revenant clawing its way from the grave. No, we see something a little more dashing, a little more debonair. An intriguing figure robed in a heavy cape, a classic silhouette in black, part predator, part playboy, seducing with one hand, draining blood like an IV with the other. It's a trope that's baked into pop culture, and we hardly even question it. Slick back hair, the formal wear, the hypnotic gaze. But that image, that version of the vampire is not ancient. In fact, it's Victorian, and it even has a name known far and wide. Dracula. Brought to unlife by Irish author Bram Stoker in 1897, Dracula wasn't just a novel. It was a cultural revelation, and it was a rebranding of something old, something unspeakable that was brought into what was then the modern era. It was sophisticated while being terrifying. In Stoker's telling, the Count isn't just a shrieking ghoul or a moldy cadaver. He's cunning, calculated. A creature who doesn't just hunt in the night, he literally relocates across Europe, sailing from the mists of Transylvania straight into the foggy shores of England. Like a virus boarding a ship, literally like a plague. And while Stoker borrowed from real-life folklore, from British lore and Balkan lore, what he created was something far more potent. Something that would bite deep into the public imagination and never let go. But Dracula didn't rise from the dead fully formed. Stoker worked and reworked his infamous monster until he had something not just frightening, but, as we said, something elegant. What Bram created was something undead and undeniable. And in creating his masterpiece, he left behind the older, grimier vampire myths in favor for something that could wear a tux and still tear your throat out. You see, the vampires we cozy up to in books, films, and television, well, they're smooth and sophisticated, and even in some cases, they're sparkly. But the original vampire, the one from the deep, dark cradle of medieval Europe, that was a thing less romantic in a foreign castle and more undead freak show squatting in your barn. A modern example that harkens back to this from a modern source would be Robert Edgar's remake of Nosferatu. That image of the vampire is something a little closer to what we think of the vampire as what it was pre-Dracula, but
much more monstrous, not so elegant.
Exactly. In fact, I want to say that, because obviously vampires are ancient. Like, that goes back, and obviously every culture has put their spin on them, but there was even a time before this where there was no elegance at all, where they were literally almost more like zombie-like.
Less human, much less human almost.
Right. They were more just like insatiable creatures rather than something that could plot and plan.
Right.
They were just more like the way a zombie is, they just needed to feed. Whereas, obviously, as we know, Stoker kind of cleaned it up, made it get a job, had it put on a pair of khakis and a tie, and that's how we got our Dracula of today.
He looked at that vampire legend and he said, make yourself decent. Come on, man.
That's right. Clean up your act. Hit the showers. Back then, you see, a vampire wasn't a tuxedo nightwalker with a flair for the dramatic. It was something caught halfway between a ghost and a zombie. Demonic, walking pestilence. An animated corpse that didn't always need to drink your blood. Sometimes it just showed up to ruin your crops, spread disease, or knock on your windows at night like a toothless door-to-door dread salesman. And in those days, there was no garlic necklace or wooden stake kit that you could buy off the shelf. Villagers had to handle it themselves, which meant often digging up graves, burning bodies, or, if you were feeling particularly medieval, cutting off the head and stuffing the mouth with bricks. Whatever it took to stop the nightly visits, to stop the rot of the community. Now, you might think England, with its mists and moors, would be crawling with vampires. But not so. In jolly old England, vampire legends are actually rarer than you'd expect. Still, every now and then a tale bubbles up, strange and hungry. Stories of restless corpses, and of the men and women who fell under their terrible spell. So sharpen your stakes, and hold on to your host wafers, because even in the green hills of England, something undead stirs. Today's episode is The Revenants of Berwick and Melrose. So let's rewind. Let's rewind this tape back to the Middle Ages. Long before Twilight made vampires dreamy, and even before Stoker had made them suave and ambitious. Back then, the vampire didn't just glide into town wearing a silk cape. No, this one clawed its way out of the grave like a bloated corpse on a mission. We'll start off in Berwick-on-Tweed, a sleepy border town with a bloody history and apparently a bit of a taste for the undead. Sometime during the murky fog of the Middle Ages, a man from Berwick died. Nothing unusual about that, of course. People were dying all the time, back then as they are now, and probably even more so back then with wars and plagues and questionable hygiene, you name it. But this guy, this son of a gun, didn't stay dead. Locals claimed he would come back, and not as some suave seducer with a widow's peak, but as something far nastier. A classic, old-world vampire. More rot than romance. A restless revenant. And while his name has long since slipped into the shadows, the story of him remains. A grim reminder that not all of your vampires sparkle. Some just suck. And this Berwick beast, he's about to show us all how low and loathsome the vampire myth once was, before literature dusted it off and gave it a makeover. In life, this man from Berwick-on-Tweed was the picture of piety, they say, draped in wealth and self-righteousness. He moved through town like a moral lighthouse, blazing with virtue and silently judging anyone who didn't attend Mass twice a day and bow low enough at the altar. He was rich, respectable, and religious to a fault. The kind of man who prayed loudest when people were watching. But death don't care how many candles you light, baby, or how many gold coins you drop in the poor box. When the end came for the Berwick man, it came all the same. They buried him with the usual pomp and circumstance. Crosses were clasped, holy water was splashed, and the townsfolk breathed a quiet sigh of relief. But that's when strange things began to happen around the village, don't you know? Now that he was in the dirt, people started saying all the things that they had once held their tongue on. Things they hadn't dared utter while his shadow still darkened the church doors. Secrets about who this man really was, about the darkness he cloaked in his devotions, and about things seen and unseen, and things felt, most important. Because while his body rested under consecrated soil, something else, something far less holy, was stirring. Turns out the Berwick man's halo had been a cheap knockoff, like a coach bag bought at a flea market. His prayers were for show, and his holiness as hollow as Swiss cheese. Once the fear of his disapproving gaze was buried 6 feet under, well, the townsfolk started talking. And what they said wasn't pretty. They said this man had been a fraud, a cheat, a real snake in a Sunday hat. The kind of guy who would tell you the Epstein files were on his desk only to tell you 10 minutes later that there's nothing to see here. He bondied it. He Pam bondied it. This man who once knelt so reverently in the pews had, behind closed doors, bled his neighbors dry with lies and schemes and every shade of spiritual swindle. He wasn't a noble, he wasn't honorable. He was wrought in velvet gloves. And now, with the truth laid bare and the man laid to rest, something in Berwick felt uneasy. But it wasn't just guilt or rumor that was rising from the dirt. Something else had been moving in the night. Something that wore the man's face. It seems when a man's soul is that sour, when the ledger of his sins reads longer than the town registry, you can't just tuck him under some turf like a race car bed and expect eternal peace. No. Folks in Berwick-on-Tweed knew better. They'd heard the old stories, murmured hushed rumors over pints and parish pews. Tales about the ones who didn't stay dead, the ones too wicked for the worms. Fear crept in fast like mold on bread. They whispered that the Berwick man's sins hadn't been confessed. They'd been curated. That he'd stockpiled his secrets like silver, and now that he was 6 feet down, they were fermenting into something foul. People began to fear the worst, that his corpse would claw its way out and come calling. Not with charm and bow ties like Dracula, but with rotten black teeth and the stink of the grave. These weren't swoon-worthy vampires, they were pests, rabid animals in a man's shape. Ghouls who'd bite and infect, whose very presence curdled the air and poisoned the well. Some said his touch would bring about madness. Others said his mouth brought blood and disease. Either way, all was agreed. Whatever this man was, he wasn't done hurting people yet. And we've mentioned it before, but Dracula, for example, the metaphor is it's much more obvious in Nosferatu, but it's even in the Bela Lugosi version, it's even in the book version. If you'll remember in last year's Nosferatu, the famous scene when he arrives in England, there's like thousands of rats coming off of the ship flooding into England. He quite literally is the plague. He is bringing the plague. To a lesser extent, in the original book Dracula, it talks about, of course, they go onto the ship to find it. The captain's dead and tied to the wheel. The crew have all been slaughtered. And when they open the hatch that goes down into the, down below, a wolf roars and jumps out and runs off and vanishes into the city night. And that was Dracula. That's in the original book. It's kind of it's not as on the nose, but it's a similar thing. It's this, not the elegant form we know has arrived, but in a weird way, his true form, his pestilence. In the original, it's more probably symbolizes more just his predatory nature, whereas in the Nosferatu version, it represents, I think, more of the plague that he literally brought with him. And the town, well, it waited, watching the grave like it might just get up and dance. Because sure enough, just as they feared, the dead man did rise. The soil of the grave cracked. The coffin moaned, and up he came, dragging the stink of sin behind him like a cloak of smoke. But here's the turn that no one saw coming. He didn't prowl, he didn't bite. He actually didn't so much as bare a fang at a soul. Because something was already on him. Each night, as soon as the corpse's boots hit the dirt, that's when the howls started. Low, distant at first, like thunder from a distant world, but then they got closer and closer, until the streets of Berwick echoed with the bloodthirsty snarls of hellhounds. And no, I don't mean stray, rabid dogs or even wolves. I'm talking beasts born of damnation. eyes burning like coals, breath that steamed in summer air, jaws wide with judgment. And they came for him every single night that he rose. They chased him through the alleys, slick with moonlight, up along the town walls, past the quay, where even the sea seemed to hold its breath. He ran and they followed, snapping, howling, never biting, but always right there, almost like they were herding him, like guilt itself, not letting him rest, not letting him feed, not letting him forget. And when dawn's first light stained the sky, the man would vanish back into the dirt, his cloak shredded from being dragged behind him as the dogs melted back into whatever burning place they had come from. Whatever this man did in life, it was bad enough that hell literally sent an escort. And they didn't even come to fetch him, but to punish him right there. Makes you wonder if it was maybe for all the people he made miserable all those years. It's like a way of, you're kind of being shown maybe what he's doing in hell. Maybe in hell, he can't even stop to rest. He's just got to keep running and running. Kind of like in life, probably his real life sins, as long as he keeps praying and putting a little money in that box, his sins are at bay. As long as he keeps doing that every Sunday, it's kind of another metaphor. Maybe it's hell's way of showing him, hey, this guy who tortured you for years, well, look what he's doing now. He can't rest. He can't let up. So it's kind of an interesting thought. The people you made miserable, even though they might not understand it at the time and are certainly scared of it, maybe they're being shown a little bit of what's happening to him as almost like the heaven's way of saying, here's the man who this is what he's doing now. I mean, who knows?
Using the guy as an example.
Exactly. It's almost like they're, or maybe maybe he is doomed to come back every night and just has to run all night, can't feed, can't do, and it's almost like part of his payment is he's got to run like a chicken in front of everyone that he judged and...
Run, boy, run.
Run, boy, run. Oh, you better run, boy. Them hellhounds will get you.
Woo! And those are the guys who do it.
That's right.
Woo! Welcome to your eternal punishment, boy.
Oh, no. There he goes. Come on.
Woo!
Because though the Berwick folk were spared his teeth, they were not spared his terror. Each dusk drew a line in the dirt, and everyone knew to be behind their doors before the sun ever kissed the rooftops. Shops shuttered early, and prayers came fast. You could hear the sound of locks clicking into place like a nightly liturgy. And after that, silence. Except, of course, for the howling of the undead hounds. Those poor villagers would lay in their beds, covers pulled up to their chins, ears straining for any unholy sounds as the hunt began anew. Some nights it came from the quay, other nights from the hills, but always, they chased him in circles around the town, like a curse with 4 legs and burning breath. But then came the night the spell was broken. 2 young men. Perhaps they were foolish, drunk, or just plain unlucky. Oh, but these boys lingered too long at a neighboring farmstead. Maybe they thought the hounds weren't going to come that night, or maybe they just lost track of time. Maybe they thought the whole thing was just a story to frighten children. Oh, but they were very real. And the curtain was just about to rise for their nightly performance. As the boys stumbled drunkenly down the path toward town, laughter still on their lips, that's when they heard it. That bone-chilling racket. First the scrabble of claw on stone, then the wild panting of something that didn't breathe air but fire. And then they saw him. The Berwick Phantom, sprinting, not like a man, but like a beast or someone who once was a man. His feet, they say, barely touched the ground. His form, bloated and gray, his eyes wide and screaming without sound. And behind him, the hounds, more than a dozen lean, black, burning things moving as one, too fast to be natural. Well, the boys just flattened themselves in a ditch, clutching onto one another like children hiding under their bed. They say the vampire didn't even see them, but one of the hounds did. Just one. It paused just for a heartbeat and looked directly at them. Not like an animal, but like a judge. And then it turned and continued following the pack. Now, neither of those young men would ever drink again. One left town within a week, claiming he heard scratching under his window every night. The other took to sleeping in the church vestry, wrapped in holy cloth, never speaking above a whisper again. Because the town knew the vampire wasn't the danger. It was what chased him. When the hounds were hungry, they wouldn't leave until their bellies were full. When the rotting man was shouting something as he would run through the town, a message from the damned, not whispered by some trembling medium, not pieced together from claw marks or chicken bone, but literally shouted, plainly, by the dead man himself as he tore through the town like a cursed wind, screaming, "Burn! Burn! Peace! Peace!" The Berwick man, or whatever now wore his face, had no interest in blood or violence anymore, nor craving for flesh. No need to mangle or maim. His torment wasn't to inflict suffering, but to endure it again and again, night after night, hounded across the cobbles and quay, driven by beasts not of this earth, damned to circle the town like a moth trapped between panes of glass. And now he was begging, "Until my body is burnt, you folk of Berwick shall have no peace." Well, two men, wild-eyed and pale as unrisen dough, these two drunk boys, they stumbled into the nearest cottage and collapsed in a tangle of sweat. They told their story in hushed murmurs, every word, every shriek, every burning syllable spat from that thing's blackened mouth. And the townsfolk listened. This was no longer just a haunting, no longer a ghost tale to keep children close. It was a plea, a confession, and maybe a chance to end the nightmare, if they dared do the deed. Because to burn the dead isn't just an act of finality, it's an act of judgment. And the people of Berwick would soon have to decide. Would they grant peace to the man they once revered, or to the monster they now fear? Well, 10 young men, shaking with fear surely, but bound by duty, gathered at the grave under a sky that hadn't decided whether to bless or curse them on that day. With urgency they dug, dirt flying under frantic hands. And when the shovel hit wood, the earth itself seemed still, like it was holding its breath. They opened the coffin and met the face of the Berwick man one final time. It hadn't rotted like it should have. In fact, it even looked aware, almost like it had been listening, as if it had heard every whisper, every prayer, and every child's cry behind barred doors. Without hesitation, the boys did what they came to do. They dragged the corpse from the coffin, its limbs stiff, mouth frozen mid-snarl, and they hacked that body to pieces. The blade sang through the air and bit into the flesh that bled no blood. Each piece was thrown onto a roaring pyre built for penance, not celebration. And the vampire burned. There was no shriek or howl, just fire doing what fire does best, reducing terror to white ash in memory. When the last ember died and the smoke rose into a slate-colored sky, Berwick could finally exhale. For the first time in weeks, the town would sleep easy. No howling hounds, no phantom footsteps, just the blessed silence of a peace hard won. But ask the oldest families in Berwick and they'll tell you, never build where that grave once stood. Don't ever walk by it after dusk. Don't whistle on that stretch of road, because some nights, if the wind shifts just right, you'll hear it. Burn, burn, peace, peace. And suddenly, the silence doesn't feel so safe after all. Everyone in Berwick thought it was over, that the nightmare had been cleansed in fire, that the cursed man's ashes had scattered on the winds, taking the dread with them. But evil, it seems, is not so easily evicted, because not long after the Berwick vampire had burned to white ash, the real horror began. It started with a cough, then 2, then 3, and then a fever that wouldn't break, skin that turned gray and cold, children who stopped eating, mothers who wept without knowing why, fathers too weak to bury the dead. The plague had come to Berwick, not with a bang, but with a wheeze. Some said it was coincidence. Others believed that the vampire's corruption had already sunk its claws into the soil, that the plague was not a punishment but a side effect, like smoke after a fire, the price of waiting too long, or believing the mask of piety the Berwick man had worn in life. They buried the victims as fast as they fell, but even as the graves were filled and the prayers were spoken, some swore they could still hear it, carried on the cold night wind that swept through the town like a scythe. The bang of hounds, the pounding of ghostly feet, and above it all, the terrible scream echoing through the streets. Burn, burn, peace, peace. Only now it sounded less like a plea and more like a curse. The vampire may have been destroyed, but his rot remained, and Berwick, once a place of prayer and pride, became a town where twilight never felt safe again. A town where the dead didn't stay silent, and where peace would come too late. Ooh, just had to take a quick pause there, Creep Street, just to give your poor palpitating heart a rest. If you're enjoying this episode, go ahead and follow us on Facebook, Instagram at Creep Street Podcast, Twitter at Creep Street Pod, TikTok at Creep Street Podcast. That's right. And if once a week is not enough for you, just head on over to patreon.com for all sorts of goodies. We got 3 different tiers there, something for every tier. So get your fixins. We even got a free tier where you can listen to the weekly sketches before they go live on the episode. Now, without further ado, back to today's story. Oh, but that was just one tale. That was just Berwick, folks. Wait till you hear about the nasty piece of shit over in Melrose. No, I'm not talking about Melrose Place where all those hip 20-somethings hang out. I'm talking about a place that's home to rolling hills, ancient stone, and allegedly the undead. Nestled in the Scottish borders, Melrose Abbey is a place steeped in sanctity and shadow. Founded in 1136 by Cistercian monks, it was meant to be a haven of holy quietude, a final resting place for the devout, and for one particularly famous chunk of royalty, the embalmed heart of Robert the Bruce, sealed in lead like a patriotic Horcrux. That casket was unearthed as recently as 1998. But centuries before that discovery, something else was said to stir beneath the soil. You see, Melrose is home to a creature of an entirely different sort, a medieval vampire. Not the caped count of modern myth, but something cruder and far crueler. A thing halfway between a man and a corpse. Less, I want to suck your blood, and more, I died wrong and now I won't rest. This creature, according to local legend, didn't just rise from the grave to feast, it crept and crawled through the Abbey's holy halls, infecting the night with unease. It was said to have been a former monk, a man of the cloth, who broke his vows in life and paid for it in death. Not just with damnation, but with desecration. His corpse reanimated, his penance postponed. And so the creature stalked the cloisters, rattling the peace of those sworn to prayer. What happened next? Well, let's just say it involved an exhumation, a stake, and a fiery conclusion. Because even in a place as sacred as Melrose Abbey, when the dead don't rest, the living have to get creative with how to defeat unspeakable evil. Of course, this wasn't some fallen king who rose from the grave in Melrose, but something far more unsettling. A priest with no pretense of piety. A man who wore the cloth like a costume and treated the commandments like suggestions. He wasn't fooling anyone. But this guy didn't have to. The chaplain served a wealthy local woman, likely a woman of some influence about the village who, for all her power, chose to look the other way. His reputation was the stuff of nasty rumor. He was said to be gluttonous, greedy, and utterly lacking in grace. But as long as he showed up, read the rites, and kept her spiritual affairs in order, well, she was content to ignore the scandal nipping at his heels. But as is so often the case in these kinds of stories, death don't give a shit about your connections. Don't care who your daddy is. It don't care that your uncle made a few calls to get you that job. When the priest finally kicked the proverbial bucket, the town might have breathed a sigh of relief, but peace don't come cheap in ancient places like Melrose Abbey, baby. Soon after the man's burial, strange things began to unfold. Unnatural sounds in the dark, cold drafts of air that slithered through locked chambers, and of course, sightings of unspeakable, terrible, fleeting things, of a shadowed figure slinking between the gravestones. People began to say that the priest had indeed returned, and not out of love or even unfinished business, but simply because corruption, left too long to fester, sometimes grows legs. And in the case of Melrose Abbey, it can even grow teeth. The idea of evil literally tainting, it's not even that someone evil is haunting the place, but that an evil deed can literally stain an area. So even once they're gone and their soul is gone, there is almost like a stain. And I don't even mean like a residual haunting, but something like, I almost kind of like the way it talks about fester, almost like how a mold grows. You reach a point of such evil, whatever, it's like it becomes its own thing in a way.
Seems like this is something common to a lot of hauntings, just a really intense, emotional, or traumatic, but especially evil, event.
Think about it like, say you get a wound, like say you get hit by an arrow, you yank out the arrowhead, well, just because you've pulled out the arrow, you might still get infected, it's almost like even once the object of evil is gone, it's like it can leave unless properly cleansed and whatnot, it's like...
almost like it draws other evil spirits.
Exactly.
Something evil happened here, and all the evil spirits and energy flock to it.
Right. And the chaplain of Melrose, if you could even call him that, well, he was a man of questionable appetites for a man of the cloth. The guy liked to hunt, he liked to drink, he liked to eat, and he loved the soft embrace of a woman. And he liked all of these things excessively, frequently, and even without much regard for consent. Yikes. Ethics, or even how many sermons he skipped to do so. Ooh, yikes, ooh, brother. He was a man of God and title only, a wolf in vestments, with a spiritual compass that always pointed straight towards the nearest vice. The locals knew it. Hell, the monks knew it. Even the dang dogs in the street probably knew it. But still, when the man finally died, the community just followed the rituals and laid him to rest near the abbey with the same solemnity befitting the cloth. Perhaps even more out of fear than out of respect. But here's the thing. In that era, they knew about men like him. They had protocols, safeguards, a sort of spiritual pest control. According to Austin friars, monks who were very much up on their ghoul game, well, certain steps had to be taken if you suspected that the dearly departed might come back a little less dearly. Chief among them, a good old-fashioned stake through the heart. But the monks of Melrose, they were Cistercians, not Austins. Their rules were different, their theology softer around the edges. They didn't drive a stake through a man's chest. Pish-posh! They said prayers. They dug the grave, they trusted the ground to hold him. But oh, the ground this time would do no such thing. As a result of their restraint, or perhaps even their naivete, the chaplain was laid in the ground wholly unrestrained and entirely free to roam. And roam he did. Because a man like that doesn't just go quietly into the afterlife. Not when there's sin left to savor. No, the chaplain didn't rest easy. He clawed his way up from the earth with no remorse, but with the same greedy appetite he'd carried through life. And the first to feel his wrath were the monks of Melrose Abbey. He came to them in the night as a bloated shadow of what he once was, prowling the abbey grounds like some foul wind in the shape of a man. The monks were terrified and unarmed and fell back on the only defense they had, which was prayer. Vigil after vigil, hour upon hour, they guarded the sacred grounds, not with swords, but with scripture. Psalms in place of pitchforks, incense where others might have used fire. And it worked. At least enough to make the vampire chaplain turn his gaze elsewhere. But not before leaving them sleepless, shaken, and all too aware of the mistake they had made in just letting him go unpunctured into the dirt. Because you can bury the body, but if you don't bind the soul, it might just come back hungry. Not so lucky indeed was the woman who had once kept the chaplain in her service, who had turned a blind eye to his sins so long as he said her prayers on time. But the dead don't forget, and neither, it seems, did he. The nights came on heavy and thick with dread, each one colder than the last. She would wake from her sleep with a start, her heart thundering in the dark, as the sounds began. First a low groan, drawn out and sorrowless, and then a whisper, wet, rasping, and close, as if someone were kneeling just beyond the door, breathing her name like a curse. She swore she never heard footsteps, but the wood floorboards still would creak under the weight of something that shouldn't be there. Now, the door never opened, but it never needed to, because whatever it was, whatever he was, he wanted her to know he was there, just inches away. A stain from her past now clawing at the present. Every night the sounds returned, as if time itself had rotted, and something from the grave had wiggled free just to let her know that she'd bought comfort at the price of her soul. And now the debt collector had come, and he was just outside the door waiting in the dark. Desperate and worn thin by terror, the lady did what pride had long kept her from. She sought the aid of the monks at Melrose. Gone was her haughty distance. She was a patron now. She was penitent, pale, shaking, and begging for deliverance from the nightly torment that scraped and whispered just outside her door. And the monks listened to her, and to their credit, they didn't hesitate. They pledged their prayers to shield her. But prayer alone, they knew, might not be enough for this. For this was no ordinary haunting. This was blasphemy, made from bone and shadow. A perversion that had crawled up from the grave with unfinished business. And so the monks appointed a vigil. Each night, 2 brave friars took their place at the chaplain's burial site, along with 2 strong laymen, armed not with swords, but with hammers and stakes and holy resolve. 4 men of flesh and faith, stationed beside a patch of cursed ground that groaned with unholy hunger. No one said it aloud, but each man was wondering the same thing. Would he rise again? And if he did, would 4 men even be enough? The graveyard lay cloaked in mist, the headstones jutting up like crooked teeth in the moonlight. Damp autumn air clung to the skin, and the scent of rot and wet stone thickened the clutches of the night. The vigil stretched on for hours. With each tick of the clock, the cold bit harder. When midnight passed without stir or shadow, 3 of the guardians, numb with exhaustion and rain, sought temporary refuge in a nearby cottage. Just a few moments by the hearth, they reasoned. Just enough to warm your twinkled toes and shake the fog off of their heads, but they left one behind. A lone friar, thin and trembling in the dark, his rosary clenched like a weapon. He walked to the grave's edge, muttering prayers with every breath, his voice rising like a shield between the earth and what might stir beneath it. And that's when it happened. The soil groaned. A slow, gurgling sigh, like the earth itself was exhaling something foul, morning breath. Then came the clawing and the crack of wood, and the shudder of a coffin lid forced open from within. The vampire had waited, patient, calculating, and now with only one man standing between him and the open night, he rose, a crooked silhouette against the moon, filthy robes hanging from a decayed frame, and eyes, if that's what they still were, that glinted in the moonlight with a hunger older than the grave. The chaplain had come back, and this time he would not be denied. It all happened in the space of a breath. A scream, a shriek not of this world, ripped through the graveyard with such a piercing cadence it could shatter glass. This thing no longer a man lunged from the shadows with the speed that mocked death. Its skin like candle wax stretched too thin. Jaws gaping, eyes burning with hate, so old it had curdled into madness. But the friar didn't flinch. His robes were soaked, his hands raw from the cold, but he was ready. When the vampire came crashing toward him, the friar gritted his teeth and swung his axe, not in panic, but with purpose. And thud. His blade struck true, finding meat and bone. A sickening sound like splitting wet firewood echoed across the tombstones. The creature howled, the air vibrating with a screech that curdled the marrow and woke crows from their roosts. And then it ran, staggering, shrieking. It bolted toward the grave it had once clawed its way out of. The friar, heart pounding like a war drum, gave chase. His breath ragged in the night, his prayers half muttered and half cursed, spilling from his lips. And just as the vampire reached the edge of its grave, it vanished. It didn't slump into the soil or collapse into ash, it was just gone. And the earth was undisturbed, not a blade of grass bent. The wind returned soft and cold, and the friar stood there, axe dripping, alone once more beneath the wide black sky. Was this a miracle? Some kind of a trick, or something worse? All they knew was that the thing had returned to its hollow. Not to rest, though. Not yet. When the rest of the watchmen returned, their feet squelched in mud, their torches flickered in the dark. They found the friar pale and panting, his axe still slick, his eyes wide with something halfway between faith and fear. And he told them everything. The howl, the creature, the axe blow, the vanishing. No one laughed. No one doubted his story. Certainly not tonight. They did what all desperate men do in the face of something unholy. They went and got shovels. The grave was soaked and heavy. The roots clawed at their boots as they worked in silence, breath steaming in on the autumn chill. Finally, with a final heave and a splatter of muck, the shovel struck the wood of the coffin. They paused for a long moment. No one wanted to be the one to open the lid. After all, you can't unsee the face of what shouldn't be. But duty moved their hands. A shovel found the seam, and the nails were pried loose with a groan like something in pain. The coffin lid slid aside, and there he was, the chaplain. He was laid out like a man dreaming of damnation, his skin ruddy and flushed as if warmed by the blood he had no right to still carry. The wound from the friar's axe split his side clean, a grinning red mouth that whispered, "You were right to be afraid." And there beneath the shroud lay not a corpse but a conviction. The man was dead, but he wasn't done. So they carried him by torchlight, through the dripping woods beyond the abbey walls. And there the monks said no psalms. The wind did not stir the branches. Even the birds, it seemed, dare not sing. This was not a man, this was something else. They took him far from the monastery, far from the graves of the truly dead. This ground was unblessed and rough, a patch of forgotten earth where no headstone dared rise. It was here they built the pyre, great and wide, fed with dry timber and dead foliage. And the flame caught slow and grew fast, and then the creature screamed. A sound like no man, no beast, no thing of this world. It curdled the marrow in your bone. It echoed off the stone and swallowed the night. The vampire burned long, hours folding into hours as flesh blackened and split, and then finally collapsed into fine ash. The wind rose then as if summoned by the right and carried the dust off of the creature and into the darkness. Another nightmare extinguished. Another vampire laid low. And still, no one spoke. The vampires of Berwick and Melrose are strange beasts. As we know, not the seductive, silk-draped fiends of Gothic fiction, but something raw, something older. These weren't charmers in velvet cloaks, they were revenants, rotting reminders of sin, shame, and pestilence. The Berwick vampire never drank blood, never spread his curse with a bite. Rather, his resurrection was a warning and not a conquest. Each night he rose and ran, not to chase the living, but to flee the hellhounds that hounded him through the streets like divine bailiffs come to collect. His punishment was noisy, spectral theater, but his toll came later, when the plague crept in on quiet feet and laid the town low. And the vampire of Melrose, on the other hand, was a bit more spirit than ghoul, slipping through walls, moaning at doors, terrifying his old mistress with nightly reminders of guilt. He did not claw from the grave like some monster from a Hammer horror film, but could blink from earth to abbey like a bad thought you can't shake. Yet he bled when struck. The friar's axe found flesh. And that's the rub. These weren't ghosts, but they also weren't quite corpses either. These medieval revenants are liminal beings caught between death and damnation, shadow and soil. They didn't just turn you with a kiss on the neck. They turned your stomach. They spread disease, invited dread. And when they died again, burned and always burned, their evil didn't go quietly. It smoldered. It hissed and screamed. And even once they were burned to ash, you got the sense that they might be still out there watching, still waiting. But what makes the Berwick vampire so compelling is the paradox at the heart of its haunting. He wasn't just the source of terror in the story, he was also terrified, perhaps even more so than the living. This wasn't a predator stalking prey under moonlight, it was a punished soul harried nightly by divine hounds through cobbled streets and sleeping homes. Berwick didn't have a vampire problem so much as it had a damned soul running from the consequences of his living sins. And that begs the question, was it truly the man's corpse or only his ghost? It's precisely what places the Berwick case in that rich middle ground of medieval lore, where the boundary between revenant and restless spirit was not so much blurred as intentionally obscured. In ghost lore of the period, spectral chases were actually a common penance. Evil souls weren't always simply damned to hellfire. Sometimes they were sentenced to roam a familiar place, tormented by beasts or devils, reliving their shame in full view of the living. And that's what I was thinking earlier. I wonder if it's almost part of the punishment is the people he tormented in life kind of get to see him now kind of be belittled and humiliated and afraid and, all that stuff. Interesting to think about. But the Berwick vampire, as we said, may have been a little bit more ghost than ghoul. His flesh may have never left the grave, but his guilt and unresolved corruption ran nightly through the town like smoke through keyholes, chased by the hellish howls and unable to rest. His nightly cry of burn, burn, peace, peace reads not so much like a curse, but like a plea. The haunting wasn't just a punishment, it was a purgatory. Whether he was a phantom or made of flesh, Berwick's undead man wasn't seeking blood, he was seeking release. And that is what makes this case less a vampire legend and more a tale of medieval cosmic justice. Not just a monster at your door, but a reminder that evil unatoned might not stay buried. And that's where the true strangeness of the medieval vampire lies. Back then, the word vampire didn't conjure images of cloaks and castles and charming immortals whispering sweet nothings in moonlight. Instead, it referred to something more primal, more communal, a rotting echo of the soul that refused to stay put, a spiritual contagion as much as it was a physical one. The lines between ghost, zombie, and vampire weren't just blurred, they were made irrelevant. The medieval mind saw these revenants as expressions of imbalance, of moral and spiritual disorder that manifested in the physical world. When a corpse rose, it wasn't just a horror story, it was a symptom, a warning, an indictment of the living just as much as it was for the dead. And often, that warning came hand in hand with pestilence. These tales didn't just bloom in a vacuum. They took root during periods when towns were ravaged by plague and war and starvation. The dead didn't just rest, they lingered on. In folk beliefs, a corpse improperly buried, unshriven, or morally corrupt could rot into rage, become an agent of sickness. These vampires didn't thirst for blood, they brought fever. They heralded death. Their haunting was a miasma of sorts. And the Berwick man didn't need to bite to be deadly. His very presence, his nightly run, his howl, his fear, it was contagion enough. Berwick is a pitch-perfect case study of how fear and folklore and fever all blend into one. In an age before germ theory, when death crept in like a thief with no footprints, people would reach for stories to make sense of the senseless death and decay that overtook their daily lives. And the vampire, that strange revenant of rot and wrath, became the scapegoat of choice. When the Black Death came howling through the village, striking down the healthy and unraveling the entire community in days, what else could they do but blame the dead? The tale of the Berwick vampire is soaked in that very logic. Here was a man once seen as pious among fellow villagers, but later was revealed to be corrupt. And when he rose from the grave, he didn't just terrorize with claws and fangs. No, his real weapon was his very presence. A corrupt soul dragging disease behind it like a soiled shroud. And as panic gripped the town and sickness took hold, people didn't look to fleas or rats or bad sanitation, as we know they should have done, which obviously they wouldn't have known to do. They took to the man they buried and wondered if they buried him deep enough. Burning the body wasn't just a ritual of disposal. It was a kind of magical sanitation, a fumigation of the soul. And the ash didn't just mean death, it meant cleansing. But in Berwick, even that came too late. The plague had already found its way in. And when the coughing began and the fever took root, folks swore they could still hear him. Still hear that unholy procession of hellhounds chasing the ghost through alleys and lanes. It was fear made flesh, grief wrapped in legend. A symptom of a time when the true monsters weren't always visible. So people made them visible, gave them names, gave them faces, and gave them fangs. Now, when I'm thinking about the Revenants of Berwick and Melrose, I also think back to an episode we did, The Vampire of Croglan Grange. Now, he was a more sleeker, sharper, far more in line with what we think of today as vampires. In fact, I think we said that particular tale, which was popularized by Augustus Hare, a lot of people think that it might have actually inspired Bram Stoker. Because in that tale, it tells of a sister and her two brothers renting a country home in Cumbria. And one summer night, the sister sees strange lights in the trees, and before she knows it, a dried-out, leathery creature with blazing eyes and gnashing teeth is at her window. It peels back the lead, it slips inside, and sinks its fangs into her neck. Her screams summon her brothers, who give chase. The vampire escapes, but months later it returns, and this time the brothers are ready. One of them even wounds the creature as it flees. The next day, they track it to the churchyard vault. They find it resting in the coffin, wounded and undead, unmistakably real, and they burned it to ash, a classic vampire extermination. Now, how does this compare to the wider story? Croglan Grange is the outlier when it comes to these specters, compared to earlier English and Scottish vampire stories, like the ones in Berwick-on-Tweed and Melrose Abbey. Croglan's tale is far more cinematic. It's Dracula's awkward cousin sneaking into the party a few decades early. The Berwick vampire was more a damned soul than a bloodsucker. His sin-sick corpse hounded nightly by hellhounds until he begged for cremation. He was more of a plague bringer than predator. The Melrose Chaplain, in turn, was a lusty cleric turned restless spirit who wailed outside a noblewoman's bedroom until he was axed and burned. Again, maybe a ghost first and a vampire second. Where Croglan shines is in its clean mechanics. It follows what we know of as the vampire rules, as we know them in popular culture. It bites by night, returns until it's eventually shot, tracked down, and burned. Boom, end of story. But in the broader arc, Croglan Grange is like a bridge. It connects the shadowy folklore of medieval vampirism, plague, guilt, and ghostly justice with a sharper, more seductive, action-oriented vampire that we know of today. It's the missing link between the ancient curse and then the Victorian modern vampire, essentially. So in the grand Gothic family tree, Croglan is the evolutionary missing link, the gap between the old-school Revenant and the Victorian vampire aristocrat. He's not just spreading death, he's hunting. And that shift from cursed soul to predatory monster is what makes Croglan Grange the first modern vampire story, as far as we know, to crawl out of the grave. Oh boy, Gage. I'll tell you, I love tales like this. I love a good, every now and then we get a good vampire story. This is just one of them. Kind of an interesting way to think about the vampire, as kind of not so much even like a specific kind of entity with a specific set of actions that it does. The earlier vampires were more just kind of evil. Like I said, it was kind of like a ghost with a zombie. It had these kind of zombie-like attributes that it spread disease. It was like a rotting corpse. It smelled foul.
All things that are like the plague itself.
Exactly. And even sometimes it's a little more ghost-like than even though a vampire is supernatural. Sometimes these older ones would behave almost ghost-like the one from Melrose Abbey it was almost like it was haunting the woman. It would scratch on her door.
But maybe that's some sort of projection, too, that we've come to know with vampires. Dracula himself comes to different characters, right? Almost like a spiritual, at the very least, a very incorporeal form. And maybe that's also just kind of the core attribute of a vampire, essentially, is one of their abilities being to present themselves from a distance. And maybe that's the more ghostly apparition that people have seen.
Very true. Very true.
But I'll tell you, this too really has been kind of a history, like a nice little addition in the history of the vampire idea.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting to see how it evolves over time. And it'll be interesting in the future, growing up in the United States, our notion of the vampire is much more of a Western vampire, what we know of from Western Europe and the States and whatnot. It would be interesting to see how they kind of change, how they might vary in different cultures. That might be kind of a cool episode.
Yeah, and what's a vampire movie going to be like in 100 years, I wonder?
Exactly. That's actually a really good point.
Even in the movie landscape, vampires have kind of evolved over time. Kind of in the reverse now that I think about it. The earliest interpretations on film of the vampire have been the Dracula, the Elegant, and we've kind of gone the opposite direction with them getting more and more monstrous, I think, over time in the history of movies.
Yeah, they certainly have, it's starting obviously with the comic book, but then the film, you think of 30 Days of Night. Those vampires are much more, they are very intelligent, like a Dracula, but they are much more driven by their hunger. They're more just like a pack of animals. And I don't know if it's all of them or if it's just the main leader in that story that has the more of the brains and the calculating aspect. But yeah, it's more of an animalistic kind of an early, it would probably honestly would line up a little more with what we think of as an older like a more of a medieval vampire.
Yeah.
With maybe some just modern trappings on it.
Now that I think about it, I almost kind of like the mix more in the cinematic world where a vampire can present itself as a normal human being. And then that moment it shows you its monstrous side.
Right.
Makes it, I think, all the more impactful.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. But I'll tell you what, Gage, I got a list of names of folks who have a very monstrous side.
Oh yeah? Who's that?
The names of our top-tier Patreon subscribers. Of course, the Dream James Watkins, the Finnish Face Via Lundqvist, the Madman Marcus Hall, the Tenacious Teresa Hackworth, the Heartbreak Kid Chris Hackworth, the oh-so-suave Sean Richardson, the Notorious Nicholas Barker, the Terrifying Taylor Lashmet, the Count of Cool Cameron Corliss, the Archduke of Attitude Adam Archer, the Sinister Sam Kiker, the Nightmare of New Zealand Noeline Vivilli, the Loathsome Johnny Love, the Carnivorous Kevin Bogey, the Killer Stud Carl Staub, the Firestarter Heather Carter, the Conqueror Christopher Damian Damaris, the Awfully Awesome Annie, the Murderous Maggie Leach, the Serve Sexy Sam Hackworth, the Evil Elizabeth Riley, Lauren Hellfire Hernandez Lopez, the Maniacal Laura Maynard, the Vicious Karen Van Vieren, the Arch Nemesis Aaron Bird, the Sadistic Sergio Castillo, the Rapscallion Ryan Crum, the Beast Benjamin Huang, the Devilish Chris Doucette, the Psycho Sam, the Electric Emily Zhang, the Ghoulish Gert Hankum, the Renegade Corey Ramos, the Crazed Carlos, the Antagonist Andrew Park, the Monstrous Michaela Schur, the Witchy Wonder J.P. Weimer, the Freaky Ben Forsyth, the Barbaric Andrew Barry, the Mysterious Marcella, the Hellacious Cale Hoffman, and Pugblorb, the Poltergeist. That's right, folks. If you want to be just like those ghouls, head on over to patreon.com/creepstreetpodcast where you can sink your fangs into all sorts of goodies over at our Patreon. Once again, that is patreon.com/creepstreetpodcast. Gage, anything you're working on? I know you just put out Love is a Psyop.
Yeah, I would say the official version of Love is a Psyop is out. And after this episode drops, you'll be getting Love is a Psyop, the Sunset remix.
Ooh. It is amazing. You really did, like, what started as like a sketch with these goofy songs. You ended up making like some really good music. Like the Love is a Psyop is a jam. I think I texted you the other night. Love in a Vacuum Sealed Chamber. I could see almost like a shoegazy, like Love in a Vacuum. You know, like having that like Jesus Mary chain sort of.
Yeah, that was such a fun sketch to work on. And that Love is a Psyop song definitely stood out to me. And I felt like, oh, this is a great core idea here. So I definitely wanted to turn that into a full track. And I also think Wrapped in Your Arms and Your Tentacles
that
could
was
be
so
kind of a cool
good.
track.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wrapped in your arms and your tentacle.
Yeah, so we might see a full-length version of that someday.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, folks, we love you. We thank you for all your support. We are headed face first into the spooky season. We cannot wait to show you what we're working on, and we're so excited for you guys to join us. Citizens of the Milky Way, my name is Dylan Hackworth.
And I'm Gage Hurley.
Good night and goodbye.